One of the most obvious features of the moon is that as you look at it, carefully, you'll see that there are regions of the moon that are darker and regions of the moon that are lighter. Now, the ancient people also saw this. However, they didn't quite know what they were looking at. There was some speculation that the moon maybe would have oceans. Those darker regions on the surface of the moon, perhaps those were great oceans, just like Earth has. And so they came to be known by the Latin term mare. This is like where we get the word marine, a sea, an ocean. The darker regions were called mare. They became known as the Sea of Tranquility. Perhaps that's an example of one. And they're very large regions. And then the lighter regions that are what we call the lunar highlands. Now, we know that today those lunar highlands are actually mountains created by impacts, massive impacts from asteroids and meteors, maybe comets even striking the moon, causing these upwellings of the surface into mountainous ranges. And as a result of those impacts, this is where we got the mare from. You see, what happened was, in those early days of the moon's formation, it was still molten within. It had been coalescing into this structure that we now see today, but it was still hot inside. And so when something hit it, it cracked open the surface and upwelled from below magma, liquid rock, and it filled in that hole. I often like to think of it like a cake that's fallen. You cover up your mistake by glossing it over with icing. So you've got a very deep well of icing in the middle of the cake. That's just what's happened on the moon. There are these large flat regions that have been filled in. They're actually holes from impacts that have been filled in from magma. And they've since cooled and are now this interesting feature that the Apollo era astronauts chose to land in those regions. It's a much smoother surface to land on. And then the lunar highlands are just the banks of these impact craters. And when you look carefully at these mare, and if you do go out with a pair of binoculars, have a note that they're basically round. If you really look carefully, they're just a series of round, dark regions. And of course they're round, because they were formed by an impact. Something came in and hit the surface and blew open a hole. And obviously it would be a round hole that was filled in. And some of them overlay each other. Well, that gives an indication of which one came first. And the craters that are in the middle of a mare, for example, would have been a more recent event, because obviously the mare had to be there first for it to be hit and landed upon. There's also a very striking crater in the southern hemisphere of the moon, and it's called the Tycho crater, Tycho. And if you look at the moon with a pair of binoculars or a small telescope, you can see that in the southern region of the moon, there's this very, very large crater with long rays of ejected material. And that impact is a very fascinating one, because the age of the rock that when they brought the rock back and they did some radioisotope dating on those rocks, they found that they seemed to be around the same age as what we would have thought of as being the era of the asteroid that hit the Earth when the dinosaurs were wiped out, 65 to 100 million years ago. And so the speculation is that Tycho probably was an asteroid that hit the moon around the same time as the asteroid that hit the Earth. So the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, which is a whole lesson in and of itself, separate from this one, likely was at least a double asteroid system. And so that's a fascinating thing, to look at that crater and go, wow, that crater was probably formed around the same time as the dinosaurs were wiped out. And that goes to show you that the Earth is protected by the moon. The moon serves a couple of purposes. The moon's orbit around the Earth stabilizes the Earth's rotation and keeps it from wobbling. Even though the Earth has a wobble, as most spinning tops do, imagine if you spin something on the desktop, it starts to wobble before it eventually keels over. The Earth does that as well. And so it stays upright. The moon's gravity holds that wobble in a stable form. Then the moon also serves as a bit of a bodyguard. You can tell it does, because look at all the impact craters on the surface of the moon. Those are impacts that otherwise may have hit Earth, but they didn't. So the moon serves that purpose as well. And one more thing about the surface of the moon, it's very light and fluffy almost. I don't want to say, maybe that's a wrong word, but there's a looseness to the dirt. And the dirt is called regolith, Regolith. This is churned up moon soil that has come about from billions of years of micrometeorites striking the surface and just pulverizing the surface of the moon, churning it up into this light soil that can be kicked up quite easily. And you can see it on the astronauts back in the Apollo days. The dirt was all over their legs, right up to their knees. In fact, because of the way it's formed, these micrometeorite impacts, the dirt under a microscope is very gnarly. It's like a Velcro almost. It's got these hooks on it because it's pulverized rock, and as a result, it clings to the astronaut suits. And they actually had to develop a fabric specialized in not allowing it to cling. When the astronauts climbed back into the lunar lander, the dust, of course, infiltrated the whole cabin, and they caught what they called moon allergies. It caused runny nose and irritated eyes and this sort of thing, and they had to be conscious of that moving forward. They even, knowing that this was going to be a bit of a problem, you can see how the lunar lander has very, very large round feet, because they knew that is a possibility that the surface could be like that, and they didn't want the lander to sink into it, so they gave it large surface areas for feet as it sat and it didn't sink in. And of course they got around on it, but it was quite messy. But this is the nature of the moon. And these days, the moon is the home of many resources. It could even be a place that we eventually go to mine. Some of the precious metals and the rare earth metals that we call them, that we require for the electrification of our future and our computer chips, they're all on the moon. Well, maybe they'll be setting up moon mines in the future. It's a 3-day trip to grab some resources and bring them back. I don't know, maybe that's a good idea. Mine the moon instead of the earth. Perhaps that's a wise direction we should go. So there's a few things about the surface of the moon. You can enjoy the moon a little bit more now when you go to look at it at nighttime.